'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring except Jerry the mouse. Jerry was inside his little apartment behind the mouse hole, thinking about the letter he'd sent to Santa Claus. He'd asked for a big Swiss cheese, and since he'd been a good mouse, he was pretty sure Santa was going to bring it to him. He could almost smell a wonderful cheesy smell in the air about him. But just then his eyes caught sight of the clock. It was almost time for Santa to arrive, and Jerry hadn't hung up his stocking at the fireplace. The stocking really wasn't Jerry's own. One of his would have been much too small for a whole Swiss cheese. It was a great big stocking belonging to a little boy, which Jerry had borrowed one night when everyone was asleep. He brought it home huffing and puffing over the job, because the stocking was as big to him as your living room rug is to you. He'd even pulled a few hairs out of his coat, and tied them together, and threaded them through a needle, and darned all the holes. Well, now Jerry got the stocking out of his closet, and being a very neat mouse, he carefully brushed it. It was all wrapped up into a tidy bundle so that he could carry it on his back. Jerry peeped out of his doorway to make sure that Tom the cat wasn't around. The room was dark except for the moonlight streaming in at the window. Tom didn't seem to be around, so Jerry started across the room. Tom, however, had been hiding behind the phonograph all the time, and suddenly Tom pounced out at him. Jerry dropped his bundle and began running around the room. But his little legs were short, and Tom was gaining on him. Suddenly, Jerry spied the big grandfather's clock. Its door was open, and just as Tom was about to catch him, with a huge leap, Jerry jumped inside. Tom slammed the door shut and began winding the clock. It was only a minute before the chimes would ring 12 o'clock, and Tom was making sure that they'd be loud. Well, meanwhile, Jerry stumbled around in the dark inside. He tripped and stumbled, and the dust made him sneeze. But he went on searching for... Suddenly he found it. There was a hole just big enough for him to squeeze through. Once outside, Jerry tiptoed around the corner of the clock to watch Tom. Tom had his ear up against the door listening. It was only a few seconds now before the chimes of midnight would ring. Of course, Tom couldn't hear anything, and he began to get worried. He opened the door just a crack to see what was the matter. Well, not finding Jerry, he opened it further and further and further. And then he stuck his head inside, and then his shoulders, and finally he crawled all the way in. Jerry slammed the door, locking Tom inside, just as the chimes began to ring, and Tom began screaming for Jerry to let him out. But Jerry just pranced across the room to the fireplace and hung up his stocking. Well, after he'd hung up his stocking, Jerry ran to the kitchen and, tugging at a butter knife, which was as big to him as a log would be to you, he made a nice, thick bread and jam sandwich for Santa. Well, in his haste, he broke a cup and knocked a fork off the table, broke another cup, and then he dragged the sandwich all the way to the fireplace. It got a little dusty along the way, but Jerry scrubbed at it with his sleeve until it looked as fresh as new. Well, Tom was still pounding at the door of the clock and screaming, so Jerry made him promise that he'd be good, at least until Christmas was over. Then he unlocked the door, and Tom fell out of the clock flat on his face. He was just about to pounce on Jerry when Jerry reminded him of his promise to be good.
And remember, if you break your promise, Santa won't bring you any present.
Well, that stopped Tom. And then Jerry showed Tom the sandwich for Santa. And Tom began to sulk. He'd like to eat that sandwich himself. What if Jerry thinks I'm Santa, thought Tom. He'll let me eat the sandwich and never know the difference. So he ran to his room and put on a pair of red flannel underwear. And then he pulled on a stocking cap and hooked a beard made out of some cotton over the ends of his whiskers. Then he climbed out of the window, up onto the roof, and into the chimney. And down, down, down he slid, and suddenly he was stuck. Well, Tom began screaming just as he had when he was stuck in the clock. Well, in the living room, Jerry saw soot falling into the fireplace, and sticking down out of the chimney was Tom's tail. Jerry jumped up and grabbed it. He tugged and tugged and tugged, but it didn't do any good. He grabbed the coal shovel and tried to scoop Tom out of the chimney. But Tom screamed that Jerry was scraping off all his fur. Then Jerry had an idea. Suppose I light a fire in the fireplace, he thought. Hot air rises, and it'll carry Tom right up to the roof like a balloon. So he got some paper and some wood and a few chunks of coal, and finally the matches. Then he struck the match. He was just about to light the paper when he heard sleigh bells.
Yippee! Santa Claus!
And sure enough, Santa had arrived. "What's wrong here?" he asked, but he knew already. Santa knows everything. He reached up into the chimney and gave a tremendous yank, and Tom came flying down and landed with a bump on the heart. Well, Santa was ready to scold him, but Tom was covered with soot from his head to his paws, and he looked so funny with his dirty cotton beard hanging from one whisker that Santa couldn't help laughing. "Tom, I forgive you. Christmas is a time when everyone should be happy." Then he reached into his pack, brought out a can of sardines for Tom, and a Swiss cheese for Jerry that was even too large for the stocking he'd hung up. Well, Tom and Jerry thanked him, and flicking a bit of soot from the sandwich, offered it to Santa. Santa eyed it for a moment, then sat down on the hearth right in between Tom and Jerry. Tom opened his sardines, and Jerry nibbled at his cheese, and Santa munched away at his bread and jam sandwich. And that's the story of how Tom and Jerry met Santa Claus.